Good morning, class. I hope we're all well. So, in today, this is lesson 4. We'll be covering the Korean War from 1950 until 1953. And we know that it was only in this occasion in which the UN was able to take decisive action in a crisis directly involving one of the superpowers. And Korea had been ruled by Japan until 1945. So, right underneath that, we have an image of a basic outline of the Korean War of 1950 to 1953. If your war ended in July 1953. And if you just take a look at the key, you'll notice the land that was being controlled by North Koreans and Chinese, as well as the land that was controlled by UN forces. Then you'll also notice arrows which indicate either communist advances or UN advances. So just take a bit of time and study the map. And then our focus points will be American reaction to North Korea's invasion of South Korea, as well as involvement of the UN and the course of war until 1953. So United States and events in Korea between 1950 to 1953. The UN Security Council condemned North Korea, and the UN Security Council called on its member states to send aid to South Korea. Right underneath that, we have an image. If you'll just take a look, on your left hand side we have the United Nations, then to the right hand side we have, and if you can just take a few minutes or later after this lesson, please make a comparison between earlier events that you may have studied with regards to the League of Nations as compared to the United Nations, and what led to the failure of the League of Nations. And we'll know that Russia was absent in the UN Security Council meetings as a boycott against the Council due to the Council's failure to allow Communist China to join the UN. And when Russian delegates returned, it was too late. War was passed by the United Nations in 1950, and it was meant to assist the Republic of Korea to restore international peace and security in the area. North Korea remained communist controlled. It also had its leader, who was a communist, and he had been trained in USSR Soviet style one party system, and his name was Kim the Second Sang. So South Korea was anti-communist, but it was not democratic. And we know that bitter hostility existed between North Communist leader and the South Korean president. And in 1950, the hostility between the two leaders became an inevitable open warfare, and North Korean troops defeated South Korea's forces, and by September 1950, only a small corner of Southeast Korea was the only part not forced to be under communist control. So here, right after that, please refer to map 1, September 1950 above. So if you just scroll quickly up, we go to where map 1 is, we'll see what was happening in September 1950. And if you can just take a closer look, we see the land that was controlled by North Koreans and Chinese. It's a bit in yellow, and then in light pink is the land forces. And then you'll also notice the arrows indicating communist advances. And then if we quickly go back to where we are, the US president was determined to contain communism from further spread, and if USA did not act, Korea was an example of how communism would spread. So there were troops of 18 countries that were sent to intervene in Korea by the UN. It was mainly an American affair, and USA was the single biggest contributor to the UN, which enabled America to be in a position to influence important decisions. So President Truman pressurized the UN to force it to withdraw its troops. USA always got its own way, and each superpower denounced and opposed the other in the 1950s. So the Soviet Union failed to veto and block call for action by the UN, as it was boycotting meetings at this time. It was passed in the absence of USSR, who was not attending UN Security Council meetings. So President Truman was therefore able to claim that this was an American operation, despite the Soviet newspapers and media was not valid. And under the resolution, we'll see that UN committed to use its member armies to drive out North Korean forces out of South Korea. And 18 states, among them Great Britain, proceeds. So the United Nations Army was dominated by the Americans. And though this was claimed by the West as a great UN success, it was on the contrary an American operation. We'll notice that majority of the troops that were sent to North Korea were American, and the commander-in-chief, General MacArthur, was also an American. Of the Russians enabled USA to turn it into a UN operation. In September 1950, the United Nations forced So, in September 1950, United Nations forces and South Korean troops attacked North Korea, and in November 1950, we see that the UN forces retreated. By mid-November, the United Nations forces had reached the frontier between Korea and China, and we know that China sent its volunteers to the war, and the strength of the Chinese forces drove back the UN forces. So General MacArthur had underestimated the power of the Chinese. By 1950, about 200,000 People's Volunteers joined the North Korean troops. Their soldiers were strongly committed to communism and drove them back south of the 38th parallel, which is the frontier between North and South Korea. So the Chinese armies also had modern tanks and planes, which was supplied by the Soviet Union, and this enabled from 1950 until 1952. And we'll notice that the Chinese were well familiar with fighting in the rugged mountains, in the forests, swamps. This is because the landscape of their country was very similar to what they were facing, what they met in Korea. So the two sides faced each other roughly along the 38th parallel. In October 1950, we see that the UN forces press on. So MacArthur had achieved the UN aim of removing North Korea troops from South Korea. This is despite warnings from China's leader Mao Zedong that China would join the war if they pressed on into North Korea. And by October 1950, we'll see that UN forces had reached the Yalu River and the border with China. So please refer to map 2, October 1950 above, if we just scroll quickly up. So map 2, right here, we'll see where the UN force advancing into North Korea. And the war went beyond America's policy of containment, and MacArthur and Truman disregarded Mao Zedong's warning. So just underneath that, we have a profile of General Douglas MacArthur. He was born in 1880, and he trained at West Point, which was the top American military academy at the time. He fought in the First World War and became the youngest commander in the American Army in France. He received 13 medals for bravery. So during the Second World War, he was the commander of the war against the Japanese, and he devised the island hopping strategy that allowed the Japanese. In 1945, he personally accepted the Japanese surrender, and from 1945 to 1951, he virtually controlled Japan, helping the shattered country get command of the UN forces in Korea. And he tried unsuccessfully to run for US presidency in 1952. So in March 1951, we'll see the events that led to MacArthur being sacked. So MacArthur was sacked as Truman ruled out an attack on China. MacArthur was willing to invade China with the use of nuclear weapons, but the risk of bringing in the USSR and starting another war were too great, hence the ruling out of an attack on China. So General MacArthur ignored UN instruction in March 1951. And in April 1951, MacArthur was fired by Truman and taken back home. So Truman rejected MacArthur's aggressive policy against communism, and he would have involved America in the wrong war and in the wrong enemy, according to General Omar Bradley. So Truman agreed with Bradley, and he returned to the policy of containment and accepted that he could not drive the communists out of Korea. In June 1951, peace talks began. If we'll just quickly refer up to map 3 again. And then we'll continue. We see that armistice talks began in June 1951, although bitter fighting continued for 2 years, and it's mainly the civilians that suffered. So right underneath that, we have a map that shows civilian and military deaths in Korean War, as well as American military fatalities per year of conflict that were actually higher than the Vietnam War. And we'll just, if you just take a look at the pie chart. And then we go down, and in this picture we have a civilian casualty in the early stages of the Korean War in South Korea, as they were fleeing from advancing North Koreans. So in July 1953, we have the armistice that was signed. In 1952, Truman was replaced by President Eisenhower, whose main aim was to bring an end to the war. So Stalin died in July 1953, and his passing dealt a blow to the Koreans and Chinese confidence. In July 1953, an armistice was signed, and no agreement has since been reached on a peace treaty. The border between North and South Korea was the same as before when the war started in 1950. There were devastations in Korea from the destructive conflict, and about 200,000 people were left dead and 5 million homeless. And communism had been contained by this time. The authority of the UN was vindicated and the war had been localized. Korea remained divided and unsettled, and North Korea has remained a communist state up until date, while South Korea remained under the oppressive regime of Syngman Rhee, who was forced to resign by 1960 riots when the army took over government in 1961. So a success for containment. On one side, we see that the Korean War was a success for the USA. Though the casualties were high, USA showed its will to contain communism, and South Korea managed to stay out of communist control. However, it was not just a success for the USA, as the USA had to accept that they could not stop North Korea from following its communist policies. And we see that the Korean War also highlighted the tensions between American leaders. For example, we have between Truman and MacArthur, who disagreed on further advance attack into North Korea and China. And some of the leaders wanted to go beyond the containment policy, and push back on communism. And these tensions were bound to affect US policy over decades to come. That is it for today. Thank you very much.